Found inside a sunken boat after 20 years, what's left tells the whole story. The silt bloomed like a dirty ghost. 20 years of settled darkness, of secrets weighted by the crushing silence of the deep, churned into a blinding cloud. Maya felt it before she saw it. A pressure shift against her suit, the cold seeping a little deeper into her bones. It was the kind of cold that felt ancient, a cold that belonged to the dead. Her light beam, a powerful spear of white in the liquid abyss, cut through the murk, catching on the jagged maw of the wreck. The siren's song. The name was still faintly visible on the stern, a cruel irony painted in letters flaking away like sunburnt skin. 20 years ago, it had vanished with its crew of 3. A young, ambitious captain named Liam, his beautiful, troubled wife, Ilara, and a deckhand, a quiet boy named Finn. A sudden squall, the Coast Guard had said. A tragic accident. The sea keeps its own counsel, but Maya's client, a reclusive billionaire with a morbid obsession for maritime mysteries, didn't believe in accidents. He believed in stories, and he was paying her and her partner, Ben, a small fortune to find. The final chapter of this one. Ben's voice crackled through her, comes distorted by the water. Anything, M. Just the usual decay, she lied, her heart thumping, a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't just decay. There was something else here, a feeling. A wrongness that clung to the corroded metal like algae. The boat hadn't just sunk, it felt like it had been dragged down, screaming. She maneuvered through a gash in the hull. A violent-looking tear that peeled the steel back like a sardine can. The interior was a chaotic soup of debris. Rotting floorboards, tangled fishing nets, the ghostly shapes of furniture bolted to the floor. Her light swept across the galley. A ceramic mug, miraculously intact, lay half-buried in the silt. A cartoon whale smiling up from its surface. A child's mug. Liam and Ellara didn't have children. Ben, I'm in the galley. It's strange how there's a kid's mug here, and the damage, it doesn't look like storm damage. This tear in the hull is too clean. Too sharp, a long silence. Then, Maya, be careful. The client's brief mentioned rumors, ugly ones. She didn't need the warning. The air in her lungs felt thick, heavy. She pushed deeper, her fins stirring up more silt, the particles dancing in her light like malevolent sprites. The door to the main cabin hung from a single hinge, swaying with the gentle current. She pushed it open, and that's when she saw it. It was a small waterproof pelican case, wedged beneath the captain's chart table. It was modern, too modern. It hadn't been here for 20 years. Someone had been here since the sinking. Recently, her blood ran cold. This wasn't a recovery mission anymore. It was a crime scene. Ben, she whispered, her voice tight. I've found something. A case. It looks new. What the hell? Get out of there, Maya, now. But she couldn't. Her curiosity was a physical hook, pulling her forward. She unclipped the case, her gloved fingers fumbling with the latches. They snapped open with a dull, plastic click that sounded deafeningly loud in the underwater silence. Inside, nestled in foam, was a single object, a digital voice recorder. Her breath hitched. She stared at it, her mind racing. Who would come back here, to this sunken tomb, to leave this? Why? She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. And as she did, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She snapped. Her head up, her light beam cutting a frantic arc across the cabin. The door to the sleeping quarters, which she had thought was closed, was now slightly ajar. A thin sliver of absolute blackness in the gloom. Ben, did you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. Hear what, Maya? What's going on? The door. It moved. The current, it's just the current. But it wasn't, she knew it. The water was still, utterly unnervingly still. She felt a primal fear grip her, the kind that whispers of monsters in the dark. She was no longer just an explorer. She was an intruder, and she was not alone. She grabbed the recorder, shoving it into a pouch on her belt. I'm coming out. She turned, her movements clumsy, her heart hammering. Her light beam swept back towards the galley, and she froze. Standing in the doorway, Silhouetted against the faint ethereal glow from the hull breach was a figure, another diver, but this one wasn't Ben. The suit was different, a sleek, military-grade black that absorbed the light. The helmet was a featureless, mirrored dome, reflecting her own terrified face back at her. For a heartbeat, they were frozen, two specters in a submerged world. Then, the figure raised a hand. It wasn't a wave. It was holding something. A spear gun. The cums crackled. It wasn't Ben's voice. It was a distorted electronic rasp. A sound scraped from the bottom of the ocean. You shouldn't have come back, Ilara. Maya's mind fractured. Ilara was dead. She'd gone down with the ship. The figure took a step forward. The spear gun aimed directly at her chest. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized her. She scrambled backward, her fins kicking up a blinding storm of silt. She couldn't see. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the blood roaring in her ears, and that terrible synthesized voice echoing in the water. You shouldn't have come back. She slammed into the far wall of the cabin, the impact jarring her teeth. Her light fell, spinning into the abyss, its beam cartwheeling through the darkness. She was blind, trapped. A sharp, metallic thunk echoed through the water, right next to her head. The spear. It had missed her by inches, embedding itself in the corroded steel of the hull dot. She didn't wait for a second shot. Fueled by adrenaline, she pushed off the wall, swimming blindly, desperately. For the gash in the hull, for the open sea, for the light, she burst out of the wreck, her lungs burning, her limbs screaming. The water outside was clearer, the deep blue a welcome reprieve from the claustrophobic dark. She looked for Ben, her eyes scanning the empty water. He was gone. His safety line, a bright yellow cord that should have been tethered to the wreck, was gone too. All that remained was a small, slowly expanding cloud of red, dissipating into the blue like a watercolor wash. Blood, a new wave of terror washed over her, cold and crippling. She was alone, truly alone. She looked down at the wreck, a dark, skeletal shape below her. The figure in the black suit emerged from the hull, moving with a calm, predatory grace. It paused, its mirrored helmet turning slowly, scanning the water. It was hunting her. Maya knew she couldn't outrun it. Her only chance was to hide, to become part of the seascape. She dove, not up towards the surface, but down, towards a dense forest of kelp swaying on a rocky outcrop. She squeezed herself into a narrow crevice between two large boulders, her body trembling uncontrollably. She switched off her rebreather's small indicator light, plunging herself into near-total darkness. She held her breath, listening. The only sound was the frantic thumping of her own heart. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Had it seen her? Had it given up? Then, a shadow passed over her hiding spot. She risked a glance upwards. The black figure was circling, a shark in human form. Its light beam sliced through the water, methodically sweeping the seabed. Closer, closer. The beam passed over her crevice, the light a blinding flash. She squeezed her eyes shut, convinced she was found, but it kept moving. It hadn't seen her. She waited, every muscle screaming, until the shadow was gone. She counted to 500, then 1,000. Finally, cautiously, she peered out. The water was empty. The figure was gone. But the fear remained. It was a living thing now, coiled in her gut. She had stumbled into something far more sinister than a rich man's hobby. This was a grave that someone was still actively guarding. She ascended slowly, her eyes constantly scanning the blue expanse around her. The surface felt a world away. When she finally broke through, gasping, the sky was a bruised purple, the sun a bloody smear on the horizon. The dive boat was there, bobbing gently on the waves, a beacon of safety. But as she swam closer, the wrongness returned. The boat was silent. Too silent. No engine hum, no radio chatter. Ben? She called out, her voice raw. Only the cry of a lone gull answered. She hauled herself onto the dive platform, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The deck was empty. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on a console, a wisp of steam still rising from it, A nautical chart was laid out, Ben's familiar handwriting marking their location. Everything was normal, except for the terrifying absence of her partner, and the small, wet footprints leading from the dive platform to the edge of the boat. 2 sets. One was Ben's, the other was not. Her eyes followed the second set of prints. They ended abruptly at the railing. Next to them, on the deck, was a single glistening object. A shell casing. He hadn't just been taken, he'd been executed. A sob tore from her throat, a ragged, hopeless sound. She stumbled back, her hand flying to the pouch on her belt. The recorder. It was still there, her only link to what had happened. Both 20 years ago and today, her grief was a white-hot agony, but the fear was sharper. The killer could still be out there, watching. Waiting. She had to get away. She scrambled to the helm, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. She tried again. Nothing. She looked at the fuel gauge. Empty. The tank had been full when they left the marina. She looked over the side. A faint iridescent sheen slicked the water around the boat. The fuel line had been cut. She was stranded, adrift, a sitting duck. As the last light of day bled from the sky, a new sound reached her over the gentle lapping of the waves. The low guttural thrum of another boat engine, growing steadily closer. It wasn't the Coast Guard. The sound was too heavy, too powerful. It was the sound of a predator closing. In Maya's world, shrank to the confines of the small boat, a floating coffin in the vast, indifferent ocean. She was trapped between a 20-year-old mystery and a modern-day monster. The story of the siren song wasn't over, and now, she was part of it. The voice recorder on her belt felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a cursed artifact that had sealed her fate. The approaching engine grew louder, a death rattle in the twilight. She had the clue, the beginning of the truth, but it had cost her everything, and as the dark shape of the other vessel resolved itself against the horizon, she knew, with chilling certainty, that the price was about to get higher. The truth wouldn't set her free. It was going to get her killed. The truth had always been a dangerous commodity in Port Blossom. It was a town built on secrets, its foundations sunk deep into the murky waters of the bay. 20 years ago, the secret had been Liam, Alara, and Finn. Now, it was Maya. Liam Cole had been the town's golden boy, the prodigal son of a fishing dynasty that had fallen on hard times. He was handsome, charismatic, with a reckless grin, and eyes the color of the summer sea. He'd bought the siren's song with the last of his family's money, convinced he could turn their fortunes around, that the ocean would reward his ambition. He was a gambler, and the sea was his casino. Everyone in Port Blossom had loved Liam, or at least, the idea of him. He was their hope, their proof that a man could still carve a life from the unforgiving water. Elara was his opposite. Where Liam was sunlight, she was moonlight, pale and ethereal, with a quiet, watchful intensity that most people mistook for shyness. She was an artist, a painter of haunting seascapes, her canvases filled with churning, violent waves and stormy skies. She had come to Port Blossom from the city, a refugee from a past she never spoke of, and had fallen into Liam's orbit like a moth to a flame. Their love story was the stuff of local legend. The handsome sea captain and the mysterious artist. A perfect, tragic romance. Too perfect. Those who looked closer saw the cracks. They saw the way Liam's hand would tighten on Ellery's arm when he was drinking. The easy charm that could curdle into a possessive sneer in the blink of an eye. They saw the bruises she would cover with long sleeves, even in the height of summer. They heard the shouting matches that would drift from their small cottage on the cliffside. Angry words swallowed by the roar of the surf. But in Port Blossom, you learned to look away. You learned that some doors were best left closed. Finn was the one nobody saw. He was a ghost long before he was lost to the sea. A skinny, awkward teenager from the wrong side of the tracks, with a shock of unruly red hair and a perpetually haunted look in his eyes. His father was a drunk, his mother long gone. He'd latched onto Liam like a life raft, idolizing the older man's confidence and swagger. Liam had taken him on as a deckhand, a gesture that the town saw as charity. Another testament to the Golden Boy's good heart. But Finn wasn't just a deckhand, he was a witness. He was the one who saw what happened when the crowds weren't looking. He was the one who would find Alara crying in the galley, her latest canvas slashed, the vibrant colors bleeding like a fresh wound. He was the one who would clean up the broken bottles after Liam's rages. And he was the one who fell hopelessly, silently in love with the captain's broken wife. Their lives were a tangled knot of love, jealousy, and fear, a storm brewing long before the final, fatal one. The hidden witness was a boy who saw everything and said nothing. His silence a shield against a world that had never offered him protection. The antagonist, however, was not Liam. The real monster in this story wore a uniform and a badge. Sheriff Brody was a man carved from the granite of the coastline, his face a roadmap of hard living and harder compromises. He had been a friend of Liam's father, a fixture in the Cole family's life for decades. He ran Port Blossom not as a town, but as a fiefdom. His justice was selective, his morality a sliding scale calibrated to his own benefit. He had a vested interest in the Cole family's success, a financial stake in Liam's venture that went far beyond friendship. He had facilitated the loan for the Siren's Song, greased the palms of inspectors, made sure the boat with its history of mechanical failures and patched-up hull was certified seaworthy. Liam's success was his success. Liam's failure was his liability. Brody had seen the darkness in Liam. He'd been called to the cottage more than once. Late at night, by frantic, tearful calls from Alara, and each time, he had smoothed things over. He'd take Liam out for a drive to cool off, clap him on the back, and remind him of what was at stake. He'd go back to Alara and tell her to be more understanding, that Liam was under a lot of pressure, that she shouldn't provoke him. He wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was an architect of suffering, a man who chose convenience over conscience every single time. He was the one who taught Alara that the law was not her friend, that her pain was an inconvenience to be managed, not a crime to be punished. The night the Siren's Song vanished, the storm had been real. A sudden violent squall had descended on the coast, a churning vortex of wind and rain. But it was a cover, a convenient act of God to mask an act of man. The conflict had reached its breaking point in the days leading up to the voyage, had finally found the courage to leave. She had packed a small bag, her art supplies, and a portfolio of her best work. She had a friend in the city, a gallery owner who had seen her potential, who had offered her a room and a show. It was a lifeline, a chance to escape the suffocating grip of Port Blossom and the man who was slowly crushing the life out of her. Finn had helped her. In a moment of desperate bravery, he had bought her a bus ticket, hiding it in a book of poetry he'd given her. It was a silent, desperate confession of his feelings, an act of pure, selfless love. He knew he would be left behind to face Liam's wrath, but he didn't care. All that mattered was that she would be free. But Liam found the ticket. The scene, unwitnessed by anyone but the three people on that boat, was a maelstrom of violence. Liam's charm finally shattered, revealing the ugly, insecure man beneath. He confronted Alara on the deck of the Siren's Song, just as they were preparing to leave for a multi-day fishing trip. The argument was brutal. He tore her bag open, scattering her clothes across the deck. He ripped her paintings from her portfolio, letting the wind carry the pieces away like confetti. He saw the bus ticket, and his rage turned murderous. He backhanded her, the force of the blow sending her stumbling against the railing. He grabbed her, his fingers digging into her arms, his face contorted with a terrifying blend of fury and self-pity. "You're not leaving me," he screamed, his voice raw. Against the rising wind, "You're nothing without me. I made you." Finn, seeing the woman he loved about to be seriously hurt, did the one thing he had never dared to do. He intervened. He grabbed a heavy iron gaff hook from the deck and slammed it against the back of Liam's knees. Liam crumpled, roaring in pain and surprise. It was the moment the balance shifted. The spell was broken. Alara looked at Liam, no longer with fear, but with a cold, clear-eyed hatred. And Liam, looking up from the deck, saw not just his wife and his deckhand, but two traitors. His authority, his entire world, was collapsing. He lunged for Finn, his hands closing around the boy's throat. Ilara screamed, grabbing a heavy winch handle and swinging it with all her might. It connected with the side of Liam's head with a sickening crack. He fell, his eyes wide with disbelief. He lay still on the deck, a thin trickle of blood running from his temple. Silence, the wind howled. Around them, a mournful chorus. Ilara and Finn stared at Liam's body, then at each other, their faces pale with shock. They hadn't meant to kill him. It had been instinct, a desperate act of self-preservation. Panic set in. They were miles from shore, with a dead man on their deck, and a storm bearing down on them. No one would believe their story. Not in Liam's town, not with Sheriff Brody pulling the strings. They would be seen as murderers, the faithless wife and the jealous desiccant. It was Ilara who made the decision. Her artist's mind, so used to creating worlds, now saw a way to erase one. "We have to sink the boat," she said, her voice eerily calm. "It's the only way. The storm will be our story." They worked in a frenzy, their movements fueled by adrenaline and terror. They opened the seacocks, the rush of incoming water, a final fatal heartbeat. They gathered what they could, a small life raft, a flare gun, a waterproof bag with a few supplies. As the boat began to list heavily, they rolled Liam's body over the side. He disappeared into the churning grey water without a sound. They were about to abandon ship when Finn saw it. Liam's satellite phone, lying on the chart table, he'd used it just before the fight. A brief call. Finn, in his panic, hadn't paid attention to who he was calling. But now, a cold dread settled over him. What if Liam had told someone where they were? What if he'd said something about Ilara leaving? He grabbed the phone. The last number dialed was Sheriff Brody. The blood drained from his face. Brody knew. He knew they were out here. And he would be the one leading the search. He would find them. And he would bury them. The boat gave a final groaning lurch. It was time to go. They scrambled into the life raft, cutting the line just as the stern of the siren song slipped beneath the waves, taking its secrets with it. They were adrift, to lost souls in a vast, angry ocean, their crime swallowed by the sea. But they were not free. They had only traded one prison for another. And they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that the monster wasn't the one they had left at the bottom of the ocean. It was the one who would be coming to look for them. The injustice began with the first drop of rain on their faces. The storm that was meant to be their salvation became their tormentor. For 2 days, the tiny life raft was tossed on mountainous waves, a speck of orange against a canvas of grey fury. They were battered, soaked, and freezing, the salt spray stinging their skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The world was reduced to a primal struggle for survival. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. The sun came out, a cruel, indifferent eye in a brilliant blue sky, and with the sun came the boat. It wasn't the Coast Guard, it was a private fishing trawler, a familiar grubby vessel from Port Blossom's docks. And at the helm, shielding his eyes against the glare, was Sheriff Brody. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over Finn. They were saved. They had survived. He raised a weak arm, about to fire the flare. But Ilara stopped him, her hand gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes, wide and haunted, were fixed on Brody. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't." She had seen something he hadn't. She had seen the look on Brody's face. It wasn't the look of a rescuer. It was the look of a man who had found something he had been looking for, something he intended to keep. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a cold, calculating satisfaction. He had known where to find them. The trawler pulled alongside, its engine idling. Brody looked down at them, his face unreadable. 2 other men, local toughs, who served as Brody's unofficial muscle, stood behind him. "Well, look what the tide brought in," Brody said, his voice laced with a false, folksy charm that didn't reach his eyes. The 2 survivors, a miracle. He threw them a line. Finn, still naive enough to hope, caught it. They were hauled aboard, their bodies collapsing onto the deck, weak and shivering. Brody's men gave them water and blankets, a pantomime of compassion. Brody knelt, his face close to Elara's. "Where's Liam?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. Elara stared back at him, her chin held high. "The storm," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "He was washed overboard. We tried to save him, we couldn't." Brody watched her for a long moment, a faint cruel smile playing on his lips. He knew she was lying. She could see it in his eyes. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her wet hair behind her ear, a gesture that was both paternal and deeply menacing. "A tragedy," he said, his gaze flicking to Finn, who was watching, paralyzed with a new kind of fear. "The whole town will be devastated, especially me. Liam, he was like a son to me." The lie was so blatant, so obscene, it hung in the air between them. This was not a rescue. It was an interrogation, an abduction. The journey back to Port Blossom was a silent one. Elara and Finn were kept separated. Finn was put in the hold, a dark, stinking space that smelled of fish guts and diesel. Elara was taken to the cabin. Through the grimy porthole, Finn could see Brody talking to her. His gestures calm and reasonable, but his presence filling the small space, suffocating her. When they reached the shore, it was under the cover of darkness. There was no fanfare, no waiting crowd of reporters or concerned townsfolk. Brody's men hustled them into an unmarked car and drove them not to the hospital, not to the sheriff's station, but to a secluded, run-down fish processing plant on the edge of town, a property that Brody owned. The injustice, which had been a creeping dread, now became a brutal reality. They were prisoners. Brody separated them. He took Elara into a cold, sterile office, the air thick with the smell of bleach. He sat her down, offered her a cup of coffee, and began his performance. He was her friend, he said. He was there to help her. He just needed the truth. He understood she was scared, traumatized. He could protect her. "Tell me what really happened, Elara," he said, his voice a soft, persuasive purr. "I'm the only one who can make this go away. Just tell me, was it the boy? Did he hurt Liam? Did you have to defend yourself?" He was offering her a deal, a story, a scapegoat. Finn, he was trying to turn them against each other. It was a classic, cruel tactic, and for a heart-stopping moment, watching the exhaustion and terror on Ilara's face, Finn, who was being held in the next room, his ear pressed to the thin wall, thought she might take it. It was the easy way out, the path of survival. But Elara's spirit, though battered, was not broken. She looked Brody in the eye. "Liam was washed overboard," she repeated, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "That's the story. That's the truth." Brody's mask of concern dropped. His face hardened. "Wrong answer," he said, his voice turning to gravel. He stood up, towering over her. "You see, I have a problem, Elara. I have a significant investment in Liam, an investment that is now at the bottom of the ocean, an investment I expect to be repaid. And since you and the boy are the only assets left, you're going to help me." The cruelty that followed was systematic and stressing. He didn't beat them. His methods were more refined. He used sleep, deprivation, isolation, and psychological torture. He kept them in separate, windowless rooms in the abandoned plant. For days, they were fed scraps, subjected to endless, circular interrogations. Always with the same underlying threat: confess to a version of the story that served Brody, or disappear. He made Finn listen to Ilara's sobs through the wall. He told Elara that Finn had already confessed, that the boy had sold her out to save himself. He played on their fears, their guilt, their love for each other. His antagonist's power grew with each passing day. He controlled the narrative in the town. He released a statement, his face a mask of solemn grief, announcing that the search for Liam Cole had been called off. He praised the heroic efforts of the search parties he had deliberately misdirected. He spoke of the two traumatized survivors, Elara and Finn, who were being kept in a secure, private location to recover from their ordeal, away from the prying eyes of the media. He was a hero, a protector. The betrayal came from the town itself. The people of Port Blossom, so quick to celebrate Liam, were just as quick to mourn him and move on. They accepted Brody's story without question. It was easier that way. They didn't want to believe their golden boy was anything less than perfect. They didn't want to look at the darkness that Brody was so adept at hiding. Their silence was a form of complicity, a betrayal that cut Finn and Alara deeper than any physical blow. For Finn, the witness, the struggle was agonizing. He was terrified. He was just a boy, caught in a nightmare orchestrated by a powerful, ruthless man. Every instinct screamed at him to save himself, to tell Brody whatever he wanted to hear. But then he would think of Alara. He would remember the look in her eyes when she had stopped him from firing the flare. It was a look of defiance, of courage. She hadn't given up. She hadn't sold him out, and he couldn't do it to her. His conscience, forged in the fire of his silent love for her, was stronger than his fear. The conflict escalated. Brody, frustrated by their resistance, grew bolder. He brought in an old, yellowed ledger. It was his private account book, detailing the money he had loaned Liam, the bribes he had paid, the illegal corners he had cut. He showed it to Alara. "This is my ruin," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And by extension, it's yours. Liam's debt is now your debt. You're going to work it off. Both of you." He laid out his plan. Alara, the beautiful, tragic widow, would become his possession. She would be kept by his side, a trophy, a constant reminder of his power. Her beauty, which had once been her own, would now belong to him. She would be his housekeeper, his hostess, his companion. Her life would be a gilded cage, a public performance of gratitude and dependence. And Finn, the boy no one cared about, would disappear. Brody had contacts, connections in the city's underbelly. Finn would be sold into a life of indentured servitude. Working on a ghost ship on the other side of the world, his identity erased, his past buried. He would pay off Liam's debt with a lifetime of forced labor. It was a fate worse than prison. It was the complete erasure of their existence. The humiliation was the final turn of the screw. Brody forced Alara to dress in fine clothes, to sit at a dinner table with him in the plant's office, a grotesque parody of domesticity. He made her pour his wine, listen to his self-serving monologues about the town, about his plans. He never laid a hand on her in violence, but his every look, his every word, was a violation. He made Finn watch. Through a small one-way mirror that Brody had installed, Finn was forced to witness Alara's degradation. He saw the light in her eyes dim, her spirit slowly being eroded by the constant grinding pressure of Brody's control. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to break them both. And it almost worked. The tension was unbearable, a wire pulled taut to the point of snapping. They were trapped, with no hope of escape, their fate sealed by a man who held all the power. The world had forgotten them. The sea had swallowed their crime, but the land had produced a monster far more terrifying. The injustice was absolute. The witness was silenced. The victim was being consumed. And the antagonist was triumphant. His victory seemingly complete. The clue surfaced, not from the sea, but from the silt of memory. It was small, insignificant, a detail lost in the trauma and chaos of the sinking. But in the suffocating silence of the fish plant, it began to glow. It was the recorder, not the one Maya would find 20 years later, but its predecessor. Alara, the artist, was a creature of observation. She was obsessed with capturing the truth of the world around her, not just in her paintings, but in sound. She carried a small microcassette recorder everywhere, a habit her husband found eccentric and annoying. She recorded the sound of the waves, the cry of the gulls, the groan of the boat's timbers. She believed that sound held a different kind of truth, a more honest one than sight. On the day the siren's song went down, she had been recording. The memory came back to her during one of Brody's long, rambling monologues. He was talking about Liam, spinning a saccharine tale of their friendship, a narrative so false it made her stomach turn. And as he spoke, her mind drifted back to the boat, to the moments before the storm, before the fight. She had been on the deck, recording the sound of the wind in the rigging. She had left the recorder on the chart table when the argument started. It had recorded everything. The argument, the accusations, the sound of the blow that sent Liam stumbling, the desperate, terrified voices, the sickening crack of the winch handle, the splash as his body went overboard, their frantic, whispered conversation about sinking the boat. And, most importantly, it had recorded the sound of Liam's last phone call. The brief, tinny sound of his voice, and the voice that answered Brody's voice. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Proof. It was all there. Not just their crime, but Brody's complicity, his motive, the whole sordid conspiracy captured on a tiny magnetic tape. But where was it? In the panic, in the frenzy to abandon ship, had they taken it? She closed her eyes, forcing herself back into the memory, the waterproof bag. They had thrown everything into it. The flares, the water, the first aid kit, and the recorder. She had grabbed it from the table at the last second. An unconscious, instinctive act, the bag. When Brody's men had pulled them from the life raft, they had taken the bag. She had seen one of them toss it into the hold with Finn. The stakes shifted instantly. This was no longer about personal survival, about escaping a gilded cage or a life of servitude. This was about justice. Public justice. The tape was a weapon, a bomb, that could not only free them, but could destroy Brody, exposing the rot at the core of Port Blossom. The tension, which had been a slow, grinding pressure, now became a sharp, frantic urgency. They had to get that tape. The plot twist was not just the existence of the clue, but the challenge of retrieving it. Brody, in his arrogance, had overlooked the bag. He had assumed it was just survival gear, worthless junk. After bringing them to the plant, his men had tossed it into a storage locker filled with old fishing equipment, nets, and rusted machinery. It was still there, in the heart of the enemy's fortress. The conspiracy was now clear to Alara. Brody hadn't just been covering up a bad loan. He had been an active participant in Liam's abuse. The phone call had likely been Liam, in a drunken rage, telling Brody that Alara was leaving, that he was going to teach her a lesson. And Brody, instead of intervening, had likely encouraged him, told him to handle his business. He was an accessory before the fact. The sinking of the boat was a godsend for him, a way to bury not just his financial liability, but his criminal negligence. His hunt for them hadn't been about recouping a debt. It had been about silencing the only two people who knew the truth of his involvement. The plan to retrieve the tape was born of desperation and communicated in whispers. Alara began to play a part. She became more compliant, more broken. She allowed Brody to believe he had finally crushed her spirit. She feigned illness, a stomach ailment that required her to make frequent trips to the plant's small, grim bathroom. The bathroom shared a wall with the hallway where the storage locker was located. Finn, meanwhile, had to find a way out of his cell. His room was bare except for a small metal cot. For days he worked patiently, silently. He used the edge of the cot's metal frame to slowly, painstakingly chip away at the crumbling mortar around a single cinder block in his wall. It was agonizing work, his fingers raw and bleeding, but the thought of the tape, the thought of Alara's courage, fueled him. The night they chose was moonless, the plant shrouded in a thick coastal fog. Brody was in town, attending a council meeting, basking in the public's admiration for his handling of the tragedy. He had left only one of his men on guard, a lazy, brutish man named Harker, who was more interested in the bottle of whiskey he'd smuggled in than his duties. Alara made her move first. She feigned a collapse, a violent bout of her supposed illness. Harker, annoyed, came to check on her. As he leaned over her, she drove a shard of a ceramic mug she had broken and hidden into the soft flesh of his thigh. He roared in pain, stumbling back. It was the distraction Finn needed. He put his shoulder to the loosened cinder block. It gave way with a low crumble of dust and mortar. He squeezed through the narrow opening, his clothes tearing on the rough edges, and emerged into the dark, silent corridor. The tension was cranked to its absolute maximum. Every shadow was a threat, Every creak of the old building a potential alarm. He could hear Harker shouting, cursing Alara. He didn't have much time. He found the storage locker. It was padlocked. Of course it was. Panic flared in his chest. He looked around frantically, his eyes scanning the junk-filled hallway. His gaze landed on a heavy-duty bolt cutter, rusted but solid. Hanging on a nearby wall, the sound of the padlock snapping was like a gunshot in the silence. He froze, listening. Harker was still screaming at Alara, his attention focused on her. Finn pulled the locker door open. The stench of mildew and decay washed over him. He fumbled in the dark, his hands searching frantically through the tangle of nets and ropes. He found the waterproof bag. His fingers closed around it, a surge of adrenaline shooting through him. He had it. He tore it open, his hands shaking. He pulled out the microcassette recorder. It was there. Intact. He turned to leave, and his heart stopped. Standing in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame, was Harker. His face was a mask of fury, a dark trickle of blood running down his leg. In his hand, he held a short, heavy pipe, going, "Somewhere, kid," he snarled. There was no time to think. Finn did the only thing he could. He threw the bolt cutter. It spun through the air, heavy and awkward, and caught Harker square in the face. The man grunted, staggered back, and Finn charged, putting his head down and slamming into his midsection. They crashed to the floor. Harker was bigger, stronger. His hands closed around Finn's throat, squeezing. Finn's vision started to tunnel. Black spots, dancing in front of his eyes. He was losing. Then, a shape appeared behind Harker. It was Alara. Her face was a pale, determined mask. In her hands, she held the heavy lid of an old toilet cistern she had wrenched from the bathroom wall. She raised it high above her head, and brought it down on the back of Harker's skull with all the force she could muster. There was a dull, wet thud. Harker's body went limp, collapsing on top of Finn. For a moment, they lay there, gasping for air, the silence of the plant rushing back in. They had done it. They had the tape. They were free. But, as Finn pushed Harker's dead weight off him, he saw the look in Alara's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It was something harder, colder. The full conspiracy wasn't just about Brody's financial and legal exposure. It was about the town. The people who looked away. The culture of silence that allowed men like Liam and Brody to flourish. Exposing Brody wasn't enough. They had to expose the whole rotten system. The stakes had shifted again. This wasn't just about their freedom anymore. It was about a reckoning. A public scandal that would tear Port Blossom apart. And they held the detonator in their hands. They scrambled out of the plant, melting into the fog, the microcassette clutched in Finn's hand like a holy relic. The quiet fishing town was about to become the epicenter of a media firestorm. And the two ghosts who had been erased from the world were about to come back and haunt them all. The payoff was not a single explosive moment, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Alara and Finn didn't go to the state police. They didn't trust them. Brody's influence was a tangled web, and they didn't know how far it reached. Instead, they went to the one institution Brody couldn't control. The one he couldn't intimidate, the media. They found a journalist, a young, hungry reporter from a major city newspaper named Sarah Jenkins. She had made a name for herself, with a series of articles exposing corruption in small-town police departments. She was fearless, ambitious, and she smelled the story of a lifetime. They met her in a cheap motel room 100 miles from Port Blossom. The scene was cinematic in its starkness. The two pale, haunted survivors, their faces etched with trauma, and the sharp, skeptical reporter. Finn placed the microcassette recorder on the table between them. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook. "This," Alara said, her voice steady, "is the truth." Sarah listened to the tape. The first time, her expression was one of professional concentration. The second time, it was one of dawning horror. The third time, it was pure, unadulterated rage. The scratchy, distorted audio was more powerful than any high-definition video. The raw terror in Alara's voice, the arrogant cruelty in Liam's. the sickening thud of the blows, and, finally, the damning sound of Sheriff Brody's voice on the phone, calm and complicit. It was a bombshell. "My God," Sarah whispered, taking off her glasses and rubbing her eyes. "He's a monster. He's the sheriff." Finn corrected her, his voice flat. "In Port Blossom, that's the same thing. The plan they devised was not just to expose Brody, but to detonate the story in the most public, most humiliating way possible. They would give him no time to spin, no chance to hide. They would orchestrate a public execution of his reputation." The stage was set for Port Blossom's annual Founders' Day Festival, a quaint, self-congratulatory event that celebrated the town's history and community spirit. Sheriff Brody was, as always, the master of ceremonies. It was his day to shine, to play the part of the benevolent patriarch. The guardian of their peaceful way of life, Sarah Jenkins and her newspaper pulled out all the stops. They coordinated with a national news network. On the morning of the festival, the story broke. The newspaper's front page was a stark black and white photo of the Sirens song, with the headline, "The Sirens' Silence," a story of murder, corruption, and a 20-year cover-up in Port Blossom. The online version included the full, unedited audio of the tape. The story spread like wildfire. By the time the festival was set to begin, every phone in town was buzzing. The internet was on fire. The scandal had gone viral. The cinematic payoff unfolded in real time, broadcast live by the network news crew that had set up discreetly in the town square. The scene was surreal. The square was decorated with festive bunting and balloons. A local band was playing cheerful, off-key tunes. Families were milling about, eating cotton candy. Their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning dread as they read the news on their phones, and on the stage. At the podium stood Sheriff Brody. He hadn't seen the news yet. He was beaming, waving to the crowd, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was collapsing around him. The camera zoomed in on his face as his deputy ran up to the stage. Phone in hand, his face pale with panic. The camera captured the exact moment Brody's smile faltered, the moment the blood drained from his face as he read the headline. It was a masterclass in slow motion, emotional devastation. The mask of the benevolent leader dissolved, revealing the cornered, terrified rat beneath. He looked up, his eyes sweeping the crowd. But the faces looking back at him were no longer adoring. They were filled with shock, disgust, and betrayal. The people of Port Blossom, the ones who had been so willing to look away, were now forced to see . And then, the final poetic twist. From the back of the crowd, two figures emerged, walking slowly, deliberately, towards the stage. It was Alara and Finn. They were no longer the broken, terrified victims from the fish plant. They were transformed. Alara was dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, her hair pulled back, her face calm and resolute. Finn stood beside her, no longer a boy, but a man, his shoulders back, his eyes clear and steady. They moved with the quiet, unshakable dignity of survivors who had been to hell and back. A hush fell over the crowd. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on them. They were ghosts, returned from the sea to claim their justice. They stopped. At the foot of the stage, looking up at Brody. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. Their presence was a judgment. Brody stared at them, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. He was trapped, exposed in the glare of the television lights. His carefully constructed world shattered. The public arrest was almost an afterthought. State troopers, who had been waiting on the edge of town, moved in. They walked through the stunned crowd, climbed the steps of the stage, and placed the handcuffs on the now catatonic sheriff. The click of the cuffs was the only sound in the square, a final, definitive punctuation mark on a 20-year-long sentence of lies. As they led Brody away, his head bowed in shame, Alara looked out at the crowd. She saw the faces of the people who had gossiped about her bruises, who had dismissed her as a troubled, dramatic woman. She saw the people who had lionized Liam and erased Finn, and she saw, in their eyes, a flicker of shame. The catharsis was not in Brody's downfall, but in that moment of collective reckoning. The poison had been lanced. The silence had been broken. The final shot of the news broadcast was iconic. Ilara and Finn, standing together, not touching, but connected by an unbreakable bond. In the background, the festive decorations of Founders Day fluttered in the breeze, a bitter, ironic counterpoint to the ugliness that had been exposed. They didn't look triumphant. They looked weary, but free. The viral moment wasn't a courtroom bombshell. It was a quiet, public reclamation of the truth, a cinematic payoff that was as devastating as it was satisfying. The story of the Sirens song was finally, truly over. The aftermath was not a celebration, but a quiet, somber settling of accounts. The emotional echo of the scandal lingered over Port Blossom like the morning fog, dampening the town's spirit, forcing a long, uncomfortable period of reflection. The story had been a mirror, and no one liked the reflection they saw. Brody was convicted. His trial a formality after the irrefutable evidence of the tape. He died in prison less than a year later, a heart attack in the middle of the night. It was a quiet, ignominious end for a man whose life had been built on loud, public lies. Harker's body was found in the fish plant. His death ruled a result of the confrontation, a footnote in the larger tragedy. The town, shamed on a national stage, turned inward. The tourist trade dwindled. For sale signs popped up like mushrooms after a rain. The illusion of a quaint, peaceful seaside town was shattered forever. For Ilara and Finn, healing was a slow, tentative process. The world wanted to turn them into celebrities, into symbols of survival. They were offered book deals, movie rights, daytime talk show appearances. They refused them all. They had not fought for fame. They had fought for peace. And peace was something that could only be found in the quiet spaces. Far from the glare of the cameras, they did not stay together. Their bond, forged in trauma and a shared, desperate love, was too intense. Too freighted with the ghosts of the past to survive in the ordinary world. It was a battlefield love, and the war was over. They needed to learn how to live, not just how to survive. Ilara moved to the desert, a world of vast empty spaces and dry, cleansing heat. It was the antithesis of the ocean that had almost claimed her. She began to paint again, but her canvases were different now. The stormy, violent seas were gone, replaced by stark, beautiful landscapes of rock and sand and endless sky. Her work was infused with a quiet strength, a sense of hard-won tranquility. She never became famous, but she found a small gallery in a dusty desert town that sold her work to people who understood its silent language. She found a measure of peace in the solitude. Her art, a form of meditation, a way of mapping the geography of her own healing. Finn traveled. He used the settlement money from the lawsuit against the town to see the world he had been denied. He worked odd jobs, lived in cheap hostels, and collected stories. He was still a witness, but now he chose what he saw. He learned to speak 3 languages, to sail a boat, to build a house with his own hands. He was searching for something, not a home, but a sense of self. A self that was not defined by his trauma. They wrote to each other. Old-fashioned letters on paper, sent across continents and oceans. They never spoke of the past, of Liam, or Brody, or the fish plant. They wrote about the small, beautiful things, the color of the sunset over the dunes, the taste of street food in a foreign city, the kindness of strangers. Their letters were a testament to their survival. A quiet acknowledgement that they were still connected to stars in the same constellation. Even if they were worlds apart. The final haunting reflection came 20 years after Maya, the diver, reopened the wound. The story of her discovery, of Ben's murder, and the subsequent capture of the killer, a low-level associate of Brody's, who had been paid to guard the wreck and silence anyone who got too close, had created a new, morbid chapter in the legend of the Sirens song. Finn, now a man in his early 40s, with lines of sun and experience around his eyes, came back to Port Blossom. The town was quieter, grayer than he remembered. He went to the small windswept cemetery on the cliff overlooking the sea. He found the grave marker. It wasn't for Liam. The town, in its shame, had never erected one. It was a small, simple stone, paid for by an anonymous donor years ago. It read. Finn O'Connell Ilara, read, lost at sight, was a lie, but it was also a kind of truth. The people they had been were gone, lost in that storm. Finn stood before the stone for a long time, the wind whipping his hair. He didn't feel sadness, or anger, or even triumph. He felt a profound sense of peace. The cost of the truth had been immense. It had cost them their youth, their innocence, their chance at a normal life. But the cost of silence would have been greater. It would have cost them their souls. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone he had carried with him from a beach in Thailand. He placed it on top of the grave marker, a final, silent tribute, as he turned to leave. He saw a woman standing by the cemetery gate, her back to him, looking out at the ocean. She was older, her hair streaked with grey, but there was something familiar in her posture. In the way she held herself against the wind, she turned, as if sensing his gaze. It was Ilara. They looked at each other across the expanse of weathered tombstones. No words were needed. Their shared history was a silent, invisible thread connecting them across the years, across the distance. A faint, bittersweet smile touched Ilara's lips. Finn smiled back. It was not a reunion. It was an acknowledgement. A final, quiet closing of a circle. The story was over. The ghosts were at peace. And the two survivors, who had once been lost at sea, had finally, in their own separate ways, found their way back to shore. The lingering, emotional echo was not one of tragedy, but of the enduring, resilient strength of the human spirit.